Mom sat beaming beside me at the scholarship award night, hands clapping with everyone else's, but hours later I saw the email she'd sent, anonymous, cruel, full of lies about me. That was the night I realized she wasn't proud, she was sabotaging me, my identity unraveled. I kept smiling for photos, but inside my world cracked. I had no idea how deep her betrayal ran. When I was 10, Mom ripped up the letter from my favorite summer program. "It's too far. You're not ready," she said. Tossing the shreds in the trash, I cried. But she offered ice cream like it was nothing. Back then, I thought she was overprotective. Now I wonder if she hated my independence. Mr. Rodriguez had nominated me. He looked heartbroken when I didn't go. I never told him the truth. In high school, I was accepted into the debate nationals. Mom said she lost the registration form. I cried in my room, hunching pillows, thinking I'd failed. But Daisy later told me she saw the envelope on our kitchen table and touched. I remember Meredith's smirk that night, saying, "Some girls just aren't meant for the spotlight." I believed her then. Miss Henderson consoled me, but I buried my dreams without knowing why. When I got into Stanford, Mom accidentally told people I was deferred. I found out at a family BBQ. My aunt hugged me, saying, "Maybe next year." My chest tightened. I confronted Mom, but she waved it off. "You'll thank me later," she said. Daisy overheard and looked furious. That night, I stared at my acceptance letter, wondering why my biggest cheerleader felt like my worst enemy. Calvin noticed the inconsistency and started asking questions. I found my college essay draft in the trash, dreaded. "You must have dropped it," Mom said, not meeting my eyes. That essay took weeks. I stayed up writing, my fingers trembling. Daisy brought snacks and stayed quiet, but her eyes screamed, "This isn't normal." She said finally. Calvin checked submission records. My original essay had been replaced. Someone had altered it with typos and weak arguments. I hadn't made those edits. My trust cracked further. Meredith smiled as she handed me a mistaken college rejection email. I sat frozen until Calvin called to clarify I had been accepted. My stomach churned. Mom brushed it off. "You must read it wrong." I checked the metadata. It had been altered, forwarded from her account. Daisy printed the real email for my records. I felt like I was trapped in a web. Every thread spun by the woman who raised me. Who was she? At my graduation party, Meredith pulled Daisy aside. Later, Daisy told me, "Your mom warned me not to get your hopes up about Stanford." My fists clenched. Meredith clinked glasses like nothing happened. I noticed she spoke louder when guests praised me, always redirecting to herself. Calvin watched her, suspicious. That night, he mentioned psychological projection. I stared at my cap, wondering if any of my wins had ever been mine alone. Daisy showed me a message thread between Mom and the admissions office. Meredith had pretended to be me, requesting deferral. My heart pounded. I stormed into the living room shaking. "Why would you do that?" She shrugged, sipping tea. "You're not ready for that kind of pressure." Her calm made it worse. Calvin and Daisy sat in stunned silence. I backed out the door. Realizing the woman who birthed me never wanted me to succeed, I confronted her in the garden, voice shaking. "You altered my future." Meredith didn't flinch. "I protected you." My fist clenched. "You lied, erased my work, impersonated me." Her smile cracked. "You'd have crumbled without me." Daisy stood beside me, arms crossed. Calvin hit record on his phone. The air hung thick with truth. For once, she looked cornered. I did what any mother would, but even she didn't sound convinced. That's when I stopped crying. I filed a formal complaint to the college. Attaching records, Calvin backed it with admissions logs. Meredith stormed into my room, red-faced. "You're destroying this family," she screamed. I stared her down. "No, you did that years ago." She threw my notebook across the room. Daisy picked it up gently. I shook with adrenaline. "Stay out of my life," she scoffed, storming out. But something in her eyes flickered fear. For the first time, I had power. Days later, I received a letter. Meredith's academic credentials were under review. Sarah, my cousin, had submitted testimony about Meredith sabotaging her too. I felt a strange mix of grief and relief. Dr. Chen confirmed Meredith's narcissistic traits. "This isn't your fault," she said. I exhaled for what felt like the first time. Daisy hugged me tightly. I wasn't alone. The woman who shaped my world was losing her mask. I wasn't her puppet anymore. I was free. Frank Eastwood, a pro bono lawyer, reached out after hearing about my case through Sarah. He offered to represent me in a fraud suit against Meredith. I hesitated, overwhelmed. "She's your mother," he said gently, "but she committed crimes." I reread the emails, the fake deferral forms. Daisy squeezed my hand. "This is justice, not revenge." That moment, I decided I wouldn't just break free. I'd make sure no one else suffered from her sabotage again. While building the case, Frank discovered Meredith had impersonated other students as a consultant. She'd taken payment to help, but instead sabotaged them too. My stomach dropped. It wasn't just me. Calvin provided statements from families she'd duped. Daisy found a burner email linked to multiple aliases. Dr. Chen explained the pattern: deliberate psychological control. I stared at Meredith's public-facing website, polished and praised, but beneath it all was rot. This wasn't just maternal sabotage, it was systemic. Sarah leaked the evidence to a major education blog. Overnight, Meredith's name trended: accusations, screenshots, testimonies. She called me, sobbing. "They're lying, right?" Her voice cracked. I didn't answer. Daisy watched the screen as thousands of comments poured in. "You did this," Meredith whispered, not realizing Calvin was recording. That clip went viral. I didn't feel joy, just closure. Her empire built on lies was collapsing, and I didn't lift a finger. The truth burned hotter than revenge. I received a letter from Mitchell Caldwell, my biological father. I saw the articles. "I'm sorry I wasn't there. He'd tried to reach me years ago, but Meredith blocked every attempt." I met him at a coffee shop. He had my eyes, my calm. He showed me baby photos Meredith never shared. "You were never alone," he said, teary-eyed. That night, I journaled. She hid the truth, but now truth finds me anyway. My story wasn't over. Frank filed a civil suit. Meredith's lawyer offered settlement. but I refused. I won the record, I told the judge in court. I sat across from her. She avoided my gaze. Calvin testified, followed by Sarah and Ms. Henderson. My hands shook, but my voice didn't. She stole my choices. I said it when the verdict came guilty of fraud. I didn't smile. I exhaled finally. Meredith's silence as they let her out echoed louder than any scream. Meredith's credentials were revoked. Her name scrubbed from academic panels. Emails flooded in former clients. Victims' apologies, support. I created a digital archive with Daisy the counterfiles. Victims shared their stories. I watched my trauma become a platform. Calvin called it justice. You rewrote your ending, he said. I smiled. This wasn't revenge. This was repair. Meredith's empire had cracked. From its ruins, something honest grew: community, truth, and a voice I finally trusted: mine. Ms. Henderson invited me to speak at a student assembly. I stood on that stage, the same auditorium where Meredith once lectured. I opened with, "Your worth isn't defined by anyone's fear." The room hushed. Some cried. Sarah sat front row, holding my hand after. "You gave us words," she whispered. I looked up, picturing my 10-year-old self in the crowd. "I'm here for you now," I said. And this time, I meant every syllable. A university invited me to co-author a paper on parental sabotage and academic fraud. Dr. Chen joined as lead. We titled it Sabotaged Ambition. During peer review, my phone buzzed. Meredith tried calling again. I hit block. "This paper will help others, Dr. Chen said. That night, I received an email from a girl in Kansas. "Your story saved my scholarship," I cried. For the first time, my past wasn't a wound, it was a torch. A podcast invited me for an interview. I hesitated, but Daisy encouraged me. "It's your truth. Speak it." During the recording, I recounted everything: tears, betrayal, survival. The host paused and said, "You didn't just survive her, you outgrew her." Thousands listened. Comments flooded in stories. Solidarity, strength. I no longer feared my name being tied to hers. I was rewriting what it meant. Zephyrine Counter wasn't a daughter of sabotage, she was a survivor of it. Mitchell invited me to a family dinner, his wife, my half-siblings. I felt nervous, but welcomed. They toasted to resilience. "You're part of us," his wife said. Eyes kind. I teared up. No lies, no manipulation, just warmth. Later, Mitchell handed me an old journal Meredith had sent back unopened. She couldn't erase everything. He smiled. Inside were my childhood poems, my voice untouched, my identity waiting. I clutched it like gold. Finally, I was whole. I was invited to keynote a women's conference on breaking generational cycles. Standing behind the podium, I felt my knees shake, but not from fear. "Silence doesn't protect you," I began. "It protects them." Applause erupted. Women lined up afterward. Teary-eyed, one whispered, "You told my story." I hugged her tight. Meredith once said I was too sensitive. But that sensitivity became strength. My voice, once silenced, was now a chorus for those still finding theirs. Daisy and I co-founded a nonprofit, Truth Bridge, offering legal aid and mentorship to students facing family sabotage. Our first client, a girl whose mother forged her college rejections. "I thought I was crazy," she cried. I handed her my notebook. "You're not, and you're not alone." That night, Daisy said, "You turned pain into purpose." I smiled, finally at peace. Meredith once tried to erase me, but now, I was building legacies, one brave story at a time. During a seminar, I noticed a familiar face: Ms. Loretta Henderson. She approached me, tears in her eyes. "You made it," she whispered. "And you made us proud." We talked for hours. She told me how she suspected Meredith for years but lacked proof. "You were always brilliant," she said. That affirmation hit deeper than any degree. My past was no longer a secret I survived, it was proof of everything I could overcome. And did. A publisher offered to adapt my journey into a memoir. "But tell it your way," the editor urged. I titled it Unauthored. Writing each chapter was a reckoning, truth stitched into every paragraph. When I held the first copy, I cried. "This is mine," I whispered. Daisy framed the cover for my new office. Meredith once said I had nothing original to say, but now, my story lived in print, and it belonged entirely to me. I revisited my old high school. Standing by the trophy case where my name should have been, Meredith had once withheld my nomination. I asked the principal to restore it. Days later, a plaque appeared: Zephyrine Counter National Finalist, Debate Team. I traced the letters with my fingers. Closure isn't always loud. Sometimes, it's a name finally carved in truth. I wasn't rewriting history, I was restoring it. My teenage self deserved to be seen, now she was. On the anniversary of the scholarship night, I hosted a celebration not for revenge, but for resilience. Survivors from all over gathered, sharing food, stories, and laughter. I lit a candle for my past self. Whispering, "You made it." Daisy raised a toast to Zephyrine, who turned sabotage into strength. We clinked glasses. The room glowed, not from forgiveness, but from power reclaimed. I had unshackled my name, and in that moment, I wasn't just free, I was fulfilled. I sat in my new apartment, sunlight spilling across the hardwood. I opened my childhood journal, now restored, and added a line: "Truth doesn't tremble." I had feared Meredith's shadow for so long, I forgot how brightly I could shine. The symbol of that battered notebook reminded me I'd always had a voice. Daisy framed my Stanford letter above the desk. "You earned it," she said. That moment, I smiled, not to please anyone, but because I finally believed her. On my birthday, Mitchell gave me a framed photo of my first poem. "It's time the world read this," he said. I felt tears rise. Meredith had mocked that poem years ago, calling it childish. But now, it was validation. Calvin, Daisy, and I laughed over cupcakes, the kind Mom never let me have. I realized healing didn't mean forgetting, it meant choosing joy anyway. That night, I looked in the mirror and said, "You're not broken, you're blooming." Meredith, now discredited and reclusive, was sentenced to community restitution and barred from education consulting. The court-mandated therapy. I didn't attend the final hearing. Instead, I held a workshop with Truth Bridge. A teen asked, "What if no one believes me?" I replied. Your truth doesn't need permission. That evening, the local paper featured our nonprofit on the front page. The caption read, From victim to voice. I kept the clipping on my desk, a daily reminder of power reclaimed. At the university bookstore, I found Unmothered on display front table, next to titles by women I once idolized. A student picked it up. She's the one who started Truth Bridge, her friend whispered. I walked past, heart swelling outside. I called Daisy, it's happening. I said, you did it, she replied. But I knew better, we did it. Meredith wrote my origin story, but I authored the legacy, and every time someone reads it, her silence loses and my voice wins.